Thank you very much for having me today. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that I'm on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also to acknowledge that this country has always been a site of knowledge and also a space of communication. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to, I guess, introduce some ideas that are part of the very early stages of an emergent project. And in doing so, I'm going to slip in a little promotion for the space that got me thinking and talking about these issues, co-authoring the forthcoming book, Everyday Data Cultures, with our automated decision-making and society colleagues, Jean Burgess, Anthony McCosker, and Rowan Wilkin. So the project I'm working on now doesn't focus on AMRs, as Mark said, but my future fellowship is looking at developing a better understanding and also extending digital literacies and data literacies within sexual health promotion and clinical service delivery, and thinking about that in terms of workforce development. So I'm going to talk about health information today, as I promised in my abstract, and my provocation is I think we need less of it. So firstly, I'm going to set the scene by talking a little bit about the current work, just as some backgrounding. The aim is to bring academic researchers into dialogue with sexually active 18 to 29-year-old digital media users and also sexual health workforces to begin to rethink and develop some different resources that address the intersections between sexual health literacy, digital literacy, and data literacy. And I'll say why, because again, this is setting up what I'm about to talk about. Young people, as many participants in this workshop will likely know, are a priority population, in quotes, for Australian sexual health promotion strategies at both state and Commonwealth level. And the role of digital technologies within sexual cultures and sexual health cultures is acknowledged within the most recent Commonwealth STI strategy. But health promotion policy and practice rarely distinguishes between the sexual cultures of different age groups and doesn't really consider the ways that both media use and sexuality, sexual practice, gender identity, relationship styles might evolve and change over time. So, for example, the current Australian STI strategy, as I said, has young people as a priority population, but it then lumps all young people aged 15 to 29 into a single target group. And as Natalie Hendry and colleagues have observed, while many policy documents go into great detail discussing adolescence as a time of risk-taking, experimentation, etc., they really gloss over young adulthood, the 18 to 29-year-old category there. They fail to acknowledge, and now I'm quoting Hendry and colleagues, that young adulthood is a time of greater independence and individualization, which is distinct from adolescence, when young people engage in adult environments, visiting licensed venues, traveling independently with friends or partners, and engage in different social practices. For example, using dating apps or socializing with work colleagues. So my fellowship case hangs on the assertion that where STI and HIV strategies that target this priority population primarily focus on schooling and school-aged young people and don't address what we might term lifelong learning in relation to gender and sexuality, there's always going to be a very restricted capacity to address the kinds of digitally mediated sexual activities that impact on young adult sexual health needs. And some of my past research has looked at dating app cultures, for example, and how Australian app users negotiate safety, health, and well-being in relation to their dating app use. And so in my fellowship, I'm arguing that an understanding of digital participation needs to account for culturally specific cultural practices, contextually specific cultural practices. And we need to understand context and culture in order to understand and engage the really complex interplay of interpersonal communication and also affinity building that takes place on digital technologies and platforms. And Mark, I think you spoke to that a little bit or foreshadowed that in your introduction. That's all I'm going to say about the fellowship today, but I just wanted to offer some context because the focus of my presentation is culture and media culture. And as a researcher who's trained in media and cultural studies traditions, but has collaborated with sexual health promotion practitioners and sexuality educators for more than 20 years now, it's always seemed to me that colleagues in these disciplines really understand digital technology primarily in relation to what we might term an information-focused lens of communication. And I'm not surprised by this. I've also observed that my colleagues in health research and also in health practice are really directed to privilege evidence that comes from some very specific commercial databases. We know which ones they are. They organize sources in a very particular way. They exclude sources in a very particular way. The bodies of evidence that are accumulated in places like Web of Science are hard science focused in the main. They don't contain many sources from the more humanities inflected end of the social sciences, even if they do contain qualitative research. They lean pretty heavily towards quantitative studies that use very positivist language often to describe their methods or describe their findings. And so when they talk about media, they're often seeking still to measure things like media effects or media exposure. And some, although less so now than in previous decades, still rely on a model of communication that is known in shorthand as the hypodermic model. And it does in fact have its origins in STI prevention propaganda from the World War period. But it uses a kind of very linear sender message receiver model to explain the process of communication. And it's quite individualized. And so my observation has been that communication strategies and campaigns that are informed by this kind of literature or this kind of scholarly evidence often approach media platforms and technologies as spaces where myths or bad information, we might say, can and should be countered by facts or good information. And here, good information is assumed to act as a kind of antidote to the toxic bad information. In other cases, we might see it metaphorically as a kind of barrier or prophylactic. And often too, discussions of media literacy or health literacy in these contexts are often discussed as a kind of barrier method that will block the bad information from coming through. So the kind of conclusion that we might make here is that if there is bad information in the media environment, what we need to do is transmit more information, good information, more of the prophylactic information or the antidote to the toxins. But my question would be, what if this focus on transmitting information is the wrong focus? We are, in a sense, using the wrong metaphor for understanding the media environment and what it is and what it can do. What if more information isn't necessarily better? And so in thinking through this, I've been drawing on a number of sources, kind of nutting out my early stages, as I said, of the new project. One is a really accessible article from the online magazine Real Life, where music and media scholar Mick Hapgood follows a thread that he calls infocentrism, which he maps through early 20th century mass communication scholarship. And as he tells this story, he draws attention to the limitations that the equation of media technologies with information has imposed on a range of disciplines, not health so much in his case, but thinking about engineering and communication. He's saying, actually, not just when we think about platforms or media spaces like, news media, but even in relation to the ways disciplines like engineering and computer science have understood communication, the information focus has been limiting or kind of blinkering in terms of what technology can be designed and to what end. And he acknowledges, and I certainly do too, that producing, circulating and accumulating information is one aspect of everyday media practice. It definitely is, but he draws on Spinoza's ethics to argue that those who view media content and media practice exclusively through what might be termed a moral contest, which I kind of waved at before, between good information and bad information, or legitimate information and dis or misinformation, may well be missing the point. Media networks, he says, do not connect our brains so much as they connect our flesh, bones, and guts. We are not machines. We feel through media. It's not simply a space where we transmit information. To put it another way, our life worlds are not the products of rational accumulations and tabulations of data. Anyone here from the social sciences is going to tell you that right away. They're constituted by our hopes, by our fears, by our injuries, our pleasures, our disappointments, our dreams. And so Hapgood argues that contemporary media economies have come to be governed by what he terms information capitalism and the kind of data capitalism that Deb was referring to before, precisely because the affective dimensions of media, which include its ability to soothe, to distract, or to promote joy, have been minimized or dismissed really extensively through a range of disciplines in both scholarly debates and also popular commentary around media literacy and more recently digital literacy. And he supports this proposal with reference to the US communication scholar Jim Carey and his theorization of media as ritual. And this is a model that Carey proposed from the early 1970s onwards to counter what he saw as the kind of dead end of media effects scholarship and mass communication scholarship that was really prevalent in North America at that time. And so in a series of interlinked essays, which are collated and published as in book form as Communication as Culture, Carey juxtaposes two dominant understandings of mediated communication. And the first one he terms media as transmission, and this is the information model, right? So it frames communication in metaphorical terms as the process of moving information through space, sender, message, receiver. And this understanding of communication, Carey argues, dates back to early days of shipping dispatches, telegraphs, the expansion of railways across the United States, where communication was, in terms of the telegraph and the early newspapers, primarily seen as a means of linking geographical locations, sending information, and building kind of specific sites of expertise and industry. In this framework, Carey says, media is a form of commodity, and so is communication. So it's chunks of information that need to be transported, measured, reduced, and timed. And this description, communication needs to be transported, measured, reduced, and timed, might be very familiar to anyone who has been part of the development of a health communication resource or a health promotion campaign. And it will probably also resonate with anyone who's ever grappled with the concept of screen time, which, as we know, is becoming less and less meaningful in the pandemic world. What's lost in this understanding of communication, Carey argues, is an acknowledgement of the ways media practices re-inscribe other kinds of cultural practices, from theatre to religion. In what Carey terms the ritual view of communication, media is not about the transmission of units of information. It is about building and sustaining culture. And this means we can't imagine a precise or measurable cause and effect relationship between a particular piece of media content and a particular consumer's beliefs or behaviors, or an audience member, or whatever it is we use as the term, because the ritual view suggests we need to attend to repetitive patterns of media use. Things like checking Tinder matches every day when we're in the library, studying for an exam, scrolling TikTok on the train, or watching the SBS News every night when we're cooking dinner. It's these habits and routines of media that give media meaning in our lives. It's not the particular unit of content or block of information that we look at in isolation. These ritual practices, Carey argues, help us build and maintain our identities and our interpersonal connections, as he describes it. And I'm going to read a chunk of his words here. In a ritual definition, communication is linked to terms such as sharing, participation, association, fellowship, and the possession of a common faith. This definition exploits the ancient identity and common roots of terms like commonness, communion, community, and communication. A ritual view of communication is not directed toward the extension of messages in space, but the maintenance of society in time. Not the act of imparting information, but the representation of shared beliefs. So it's, as I say, just to reiterate, a kind of temporal process, a process of sedimentation, of repetition, of iteration. Engaging with media can, according to the ritual view, be more like attending mass or a similar familiar community gathering where the words maybe haven't changed from the last time you were there, but being there is in itself a source of communion and comfort. That's quite different to understanding media engagement as a unit of, as a space where information is transmitted. It may be shared, it may be acquired, it may be passed around, it may be archived, but that is occurring in the context of cultural practice as part of shared feelings and senses and aesthetic experiences. So you might say, okay, Kath, good, that's cool. What does it have to do in, with this question of health communication? So what does it have to do with health communication? Okay, in my own thinking about what digital literacy could look like at an organizational level, in a sexual health organization, for example, I'm already trying to move away from the notion that an individual possesses digital literacy or sexual literacy and think more about communal practices of literacy or capacity or capability. What is our sense as a collective group of how digital media works and what we do with it? Not can I, as an individual, open my phone, turn on the app? Well, that's a kind of different form of literacy. So my question then is, if we're thinking about, the conversation we might have today about microbial resistance, antimicrobial resistance, what if the focus of professional health communicators in this space was first and foremost understanding and entering into dialogue with the sensory and affective and emotional and communal dimensions of health cultures. And before I wrap up, I'm not going to take my full 20 minutes, I don't think, but I will reiterate that I don't believe that mediated communication is never about transmitting information. That's not what I'm saying. Of course it is, but I think it's pretty clear from everything we can see right now about the ways media has played out in kind of community formation and political formations recently, that blasting more and more information into densely mediated environments is not especially helpful or productive. And as Hapgood notes, we can see pretty clearly that building new top-down technologies or media forms or, you know, new apps or new platforms based on a media as transmission model, and then expecting them to facilitate the formation of community isn't going to work especially well, because the assumptions that are built into, you know, what Mark's already mentioned, the kind of techno-solutionist model are about the transmission of information, not the kind of social and interpersonal elements of ritual use of technology. So I also agree with Hapgood that it's really worth now stepping back from a close scrutiny of information and asking instead, what happens if we move away from terms like effects or impacts or acceptability or efficacy in relation to media, and start thinking about health communication in relation to rituals, cultures, and communities. And this approach has plenty of precedents in Australia, particularly in relation to the Australian responses to HIV. For example, Michael Hurley's model of HIV cultures of care mapped the relationships between gay men, social researchers, queer community press, epidemiologists, queer events and venues, and health service providers, you know, clinical providers, and showed the ways that they were interconnected in their response to HIV, and observed that mediated communication was central to the formation and maintenance of communal care practices in the height of the pandemic. And I don't want to sound kind of naive or utopian. I know that lots of HIV positive people were considered to be outside of the bounds of this community, and that experience of exclusion added to their isolation and stigma, and that continues today. But what I'm suggesting is that in the current context, we need to begin to think about media as something more than a delivery system for transmitting health messages. It needs to be a site of communal engagement and multi-directional conversation. And there is obviously in Australia too a really substantial history of entertainment education or kind of popular media conversations about health, and Deborah wrote about it many years ago in relation to soap operas here. But I will observe that a reasonably recent evaluation of a review, I should say, large literature review of evaluations of entertainment, education, health communication projects, where researchers and health promotion staff had worked in partnership with commercial entertainment producers, found that in the literature, at least, researchers and health professionals tended to talk about that partnership as if it were a one-way process of the expert health professional educating the media producer, as opposed to engaging in a reciprocal learning process about health research and practice and communication. So I'm really happy to wrap up here and to take this one into a broader conversation. I want to obviously acknowledge the economic and policy drivers of you know, the ways that we're understanding what health communication is and what it does in the present, you know, what we might term conjuncture, the political setting that we live in today. But I'm hoping that we might open up a conversation about some more diverse ways of thinking about health in mediated contexts. Thanks a lot.